Hello, welcome back to Radio Free Gastonia, the internet's most beloved source of emergency history content. We're checking in here with a little bonus episode. It's a summer reading note. Whiling away those dog days of summer, what can you do? But this has specifically to do with some debates that are current in the United States in the summer of 2020, and pertinent, and some literature that's pertinent for that, but really this literature has been pertinent for considerations of ethics and policy for my entire life, growing up and living in this country, and really for the entire history of the country, as we'll see. So the name of this episode is The Lumpy Net. I will explain what this somewhat upsetting phrase means in a little bit. But the place I wanted to start was this discussion that's in Washington, it's in the media, about how to deal with the economic ramifications of the coronavirus or COVID disaster, economically speaking. So what do we do when people are out of work, can't pay the rent, can't pay mortgage, and so forth? The immediate response to that, and I think quite a reasonable one, was to send people money in the spring. Emergency relief. Now, this is interesting because, similar kinds of policies were pursued in the 1930s in the Great Depression with FDR. Andrew Yang, who was a candidate running for the Democratic nomination in 2019-2020, put forth the idea of universal basic income. Of course, he didn't come up with that idea himself, but he brought this idea into the mainstream of discussion in a way that was really surprising. And when it was first making contact with public discourse in America, a lot of people were like, that's crazy. How can you just send people money? We couldn't possibly afford that. And also, it's wrong. People won't work. And people from the right and the left had critiques of this idea of UBI, Universal Basic Income. Lo and behold, just about a month after Andrew Yang is out of the Democratic presidential nomination race, we are mired in a world historical catastrophe where the government is literally just signing and sending checks to Americans, because it's like my one of my favorite sayings. The problem with poor people is that they don't have money. So we're in a moment now in July 2020. Again, I think that this discussion is probably pertinent well after this video and long before, but in this particular context, about whether the $600 checks of unemployment assistance should be sent to people, should be extended beyond their original termination point. And one of the points that the Trump administration and Republicans in Congress have made about, the inadvisability of continuing this policy is that if people get $600 a week, they might be making more money than they would have otherwise if they were working, which means that they would just sit at home and collect those checks and not work. Now, people on the left pretty quickly responded to that and said, well, if they're getting more with a measly $600 a week than they would have gotten in their job, where they, like, if you're a server in a restaurant, make, $2 or $3 an hour, then maybe there's something wrong with that situation. Maybe we're really focusing on the wrong issue here if we're worried about people being incentivized to not work. Now, this brings to mind a lot of big issues in American history about the political economy, the moral economy of how capitalism works or should work, and also this moral question of being deserving or not, whether I morally deserve help from others, and whether others are morally obligated to help those in need, whether through private charity or through taxation for social services. The former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, who ran for vice president in 2012, made the colorful comment at the Republican National Convention that we run the risk of the social safety net turning into a hammock. So you can see kind of the trend of the discussion here. People will be lazy if you let them. And so thus, all of our policies should be oriented toward maximizing people's participation in the labor force and minimizing their sort of propensity toward lassitude and freeloading. Now, this informs a lot of American history, and it's commonly believed in the U.S. and abroad that the United States has a unusually limited or truncated social safety net or welfare state. Now, this is kind of true, but in some ways it's not. You know, the U.S. federal government in particular, and the states in other ways, but particularly the federal government, intercedes in the economy and supports people and businesses and communities in all kinds of different ways that are extremely complicated. That's the way we like to do things. So instead of having sort of a generous welfare state where everyone has universal access to health care or paid sick leave, maternity and paternity leave, and so forth that you might have in Sweden or France, we have all these extremely weird workarounds that are meant to kind of make it invisible the way that we're helping people because we don't like the idea of the government helping people. So, tax incentives and credits, the earned income tax credit, which essentially, pays low-income workers a little bit extra to bump them up as kind of like a reward for working. Like, we want you in the workforce, so if you make shit, then you'll get this extra benefit at the end of the year that sort of ameliorates the fact that you're paid so little. That's considered, this policy, when it was developed in the 80s and 90s, was meant to be an alternative to welfare, which was bad because, you're not working, and that's unvirtuous. So I want to talk about just a few important thinkers and scholars and books that I think would be really helpful in thinking about this question of deservingness and how that relates to American social policy. So this is the lumpy net. A lot of people say we have a threadbare or barely existent social safety net. I think it's probably more apt to say it's patchy. In some places it's quite robust and strong, in others it's non-existent. It's a lumpy net. And we'll see why, because we've had this propensity to carve out like categories of people who deserve and don't. This is the idea of the deserving poor, for instance, who are outnumbered greatly by their cousins, the undeserving poor, in most of our history, at least in the way that people think, in the way policymakers think, and maybe voters as well. So I want to talk about a few things. First, there's John Rawls. This philosopher is very influential, lived from 1921 to 2002, in many ways the most prominent and influential liberal political philosopher of the post-war U.S. era. This being the time period when the U.S. was, having large amounts of economic growth and widening economic prosperity and so forth. He became sort of the most influential figure in some ways because he provided a philosophical justification for the sort of social arrangement of big business, government, and labor, and other constituents of society after World War II in America's, particularly unique and attenuated version of a welfare state. So he had this idea called the veil of ignorance. The question here is to think, how should we structure society? This goes back to all the classic social contract thinkers, such as John Locke or Rousseau. Think, what is the deal of society? What have we agreed on? We talked about this a lot in the U.S. in the 20th century course. What should the blueprint for this look like? And what Rawls said is basically that imagine you're in this original position, before we're all born. Maybe there's a pre-born state where we exist as consciousnesses, but not as in actual people who corporally exist in the world. And we say, okay, so how should society work? What's fair? Now, could there be people who are, fantastically rich? There could be people who own other people, a slave society. Now, if you were in this original position, you probably would not think that a slave society would be a good idea, because the key here is you don't know where you're going to land in this whole thing. This is asking you to say, what do you think is a fair society? If you didn't know if you were the slave or the slave owner, the king or the peasant, what would work? Well, it would look a lot like post-war American society, at least in one interpretation. So we would want a society where, there's some people who are very well off and successful and enjoy the benefit of their talent or hard work. And there are some people who are poor because maybe they lack certain talents or, delayed impulses for delayed gratification. Maybe they're just not ambitious and they want to work a low-pressure, low-income job and just chill out and play video games. Like, we could have a society where the extremes are not too low, because you definitely don't want one where, you end up, desperately poor with no resources from day one, and all the odds are stacked against you, unequal healthcare system, lack of access to any kind of education, where you just end up covered in flies dying in a ditch. You could, maybe in this scenario, roll the dice and think, maybe I'll be born as a Trump. But I don't know if that would necessarily even be that great of a thing in itself. However, what kind of social arrangements in terms of education and democracy and social services and redistribution of wealth would we think would create a society where there's room for people to, land at different places in the end? We're not enforcing some sort of communist uniformity across the board where everybody's exactly the same, because people are different. And, we do kind of have a sense that, like, some people maybe deserve to enjoy the benefit of their work or abilities a little bit more than, others who maybe didn't work as hard, right? Anybody who's worked on a group project kind of understands that. So Rawls provided this thought experiment, and it really does give people pause to say, well, okay, so what if I were in the other person's shoes? What if I was a poor mother in Flint, Michigan, whose child has been poisoned by lead? That person didn't cause the lead, and they didn't cause the lack of resources and poverty and discrimination and all the other things that, made their horizons of possibility so much more limited. So maybe that's not fair. Now, if you are rich and privileged and have always had everything fine and don't really know any poor people, you might think that, well, that lady should have worked a little harder, been a little more organized. That's the other version of American thinking, is that the more predominant one, which is that anybody can make it by dint of determination, talent, smarts. So this, I start with Rawls here because it is a question about what is fair. And the question here gets translated into policy. Rawls, he's a philosopher, so this is a moral thought experiment. But the key idea in there was deservingness. Does the person at the very bottom deserve to be there? Does the person at the top who inherited all their wealth deserve to be there? Everybody has a sense of fairness. If you have children or you've been around small children, you know that 90% of human life from the beginning is arguing over what's fair, that's no fair, why does he have that and I don't, and so forth. He took that from me, whether that's a beach ball or a fantastic fortune of billions. So in the United States, our social policy has been based not on this idea that everybody deserves sort of basic things. To some extent, the idea of public education originally was meant to be sort of the great equalizer, that, yes, this is one thing that everybody does deserve. Everybody deserves a strong national defense. These are public goods that apply to everyone, but there are not that many of them in the American way of thinking. So who deserves help from the government? If everybody's an individual who can work hard and succeed, who deserves help? So there are a few, books that I think are really useful in this regard. One is by Theda Skocpol called Protecting Soldiers and Mothers. So this is a book about sort of long history of American, policies to help people in need. And the basic insight here is that we have allocated resources to people who we think deserve it by either their moral virtue or by the hazards of chance that don't, they're not responsible for. So a soldier, a veteran who fought and risked their life for the country deserves something from the government, and by the government we mean like by us as a community, we owe it to them. So this, was a justification for the pension system that was developed after the Civil War that benefited veterans of the North. We should give them money. Like, look, they're injured, or they're traumatized. They didn't use that word back then, but those are deserving people, soldiers, and also mothers, women raising children. They are vulnerable. They're in need. Through no fault of their own. They were born a woman, and they are mothers. They have children. That's natural, and there are all kinds of hazards in life that affect women, like feckless husbands and partners who are drunk, abusive, absent. A woman is a vulnerable, needy creature, is sort of an idea here, but we also, idealize motherhood. So soldiers, mothers. All the other people can go jump in a fucking lake. Maybe not. So that's one book. I really recommend Protecting Soldiers and Mothers if you're interested in sort of the origins of American social policy and the welfare state. Another book that is really fantastic is by Linda Gordon. It's called Pitied but Not Entitled. And it's about the origins of the policy that we call welfare in America. Now, social welfare or welfare state applies to the vast array of programs to provide services to the public in any society. But in America, the word welfare specifically got attached to a part of the New Deal, which was originally called Aid to Families with, it was ADC at first, and the point is it became Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC. A lot of people don't realize this was part of the Social Security Act, which most people like, but don't realize that one of the components of it was aid to mothers in need, poor mothers, abandoned, helpless mothers. This is a society where it was still thought that the male breadwinner would be the norm, and that, women have always worked outside the home, for sure, and in the wage market and in unwaged work. But the ideal that people had in mind was that normally, in our normative sense, the guy would be out there with his lunch pail, earning the bacon and bringing it home. The mother would be at home nurturing the children. And so, thus, if she's put in a situation where she doesn't have the resources to do that and she's alone, then, we should help her because she is not a male breadwinner. So this was there had been a long discussion in the U.S. prior to this about the idea of mothers' pensions, framing it in more of a workerist context, like a pension, like a worker would have for a paid, waged, or salaried job. That had been going on for a while, but it never quite took. It did in 1935 with Social Security Act. Now, the point that Gordon makes that's so important is that they were pitied but not entitled. So a working man earns his Social Security benefit. It is an earned benefit. It's not a handout. It's not a freebie. Like, this is the way of thinking anyway. A man goes out there and earns it. It's an entitlement. But a woman, a poor mother, is an object of pity. This is not, pellets that she piled up in her years of workerly service in the wage workforce. This is something we do because she's helpless, defenseless, and it's sad. that obviously puts the person who receives that benefit in a rather disadvantaged and stigmatized position compared to the person who earned their benefit. Now, there are lots of reasons to have problems with this, least of all, not the least of which is the sexism, but, this is part of the mystification of American social policy. Social Security is a welfare program for the elderly, but we dress it up and pretend that it's a pension because we are more comfortable with that. Now, we could have benefits where everybody equally got them across the board that were universal, but that would scoop in some of these undeserving people, irresponsible, lazy, whatever, criminally insane, drug addicts, people who don't deserve to be subsidized by the government. So, Gordon charts sort of the history of welfare. She wrote this book sort of on the eve of the welfare reform that was passed in the 1990s by President Clinton and the Republican Congress, which destroyed aid to families with dependent children and replaced it with a much more stringent and stingy program called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, the catchy acronym TANF. You only are able to get these benefits for a very limited period of time and only for a certain amount of time in your lifetime. It's doled out to the states so that those states can mess around with it and be more parsimonious. Anyway, that's a long story. But what you could say in looking at this is that by the 1990s, this idea that the mother should be home with the children kind of changed. Not completely gone, for sure. A lot of people still felt that way as an ideal. But in reality, women had entered the paid, waged, salaried workforce in much greater numbers from the 1960s forward. And so this idea that these women are just sitting at home collecting a check for, quote, doing nothing, which, as anybody who's raised children knows, is not work at all. We're not going to have it. We're cutting them off. Got to get them out there. So that's, that's a cultural sea change, I think. And it's based on sort of obviously racist ideals because not that many people had a problem with this program until the 1960s when some very brave and inspiring women formed organizations to fight for welfare rights, to be treated better, to not be treated like, needy, pitiful scum, but to get better benefits to raise healthy families and have some, equity and dignity. Those movements were conspicuously led by black women, also at a time when the civil rights movement was clamoring for the redress of social, economic, historic inequities. Ira Katznelson, in a book called When Affirmative Action Was White, talks about how the government had all these benefits for people back in the 30s and 40s, and by and large, white America was okay with it because they were benefiting from it. And for a variety of reasons that I can't go into right now, many people of color and other ethnic minorities were and women were excluded from those benefits. As soon as they got those benefits and things like redlining and so forth were at least officially banned in the 60s, all of a sudden, I don't know about this idea of people getting money from the government. I earned it myself. So that's part of the irony of history. This idea of the welfare queen also with Ronald Reagan in the 80s, a racialized, sexist, just rather nasty and not based in reality at all idea that women are just sitting at home having children for the express purpose of getting more money from the state and gaming the system, manipulating things, living better than the good, decent working people. The moral story being told here was that, my life fucking sucks. I have to get up at 4 in the morning, get ready for work, get my kids fed and dressed, out to school. I go to this job that I hate with these coworkers that I hate, with this boss that I hate. I make very little money. We're always just on the verge of not making it, which for the last 40 years in America has been the lot of, a lot of people. I'm going through all this, and that lady's sitting at home doing nothing, and I'm paying for it? Hell no. So that's the moral story that's being told by Reagan with the welfare queen, and by, let's be honest, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich in the 90s with welfare reform. Those people were not deserving anymore. Now, that's a big part of the story, because right now we're talking about do we destroy the nature of society? Do we turn the social safety net into a hammock if we make the fatal error, the moral hazard of just giving people money and they won't go to work? One of the, I think, underlying intentions of welfare reform was to force all these women out into extremely exploited low-wage work. To say, yeah, well, I don't know, dude, you got to go work at this miserable job at Burger King and find something to do with your kids while you're there, because we're cutting you off, has the side effect benefit of supplying Burger King and so forth with a supply of workers who probably would rather not be doing that job for that pay, but really have no other choice. So it's kind of conscripting people into the low-wage workforce. Finally, I want to bring this all back, though, because this idea of deservingness has to do with your work ethic and your level of responsibility, and for most of our history, your gender and race as well. But it also has to do with something else, which is fate and chance. There's another historian named Michele Landis Dauber who wrote a book called The Sympathetic State. And she makes this really fascinating point in the book that, you know what, actually the federal government was providing benefits and support to the public a long time before what we think of as the modern welfare state with the New Deal or the reforms of the 1960s and all the policies that followed from those. Actually, the U.S. government was providing relief to people who were victims of floods. And anybody who knows American history knows there's been a lot of very big, very tragic floods that affected lots of people. Now, what's the idea behind helping somebody who is in a flood? We can tell from recent history that we often don't care about people who are affected by flood. See Katrina, 2005. But the idea here is quite obvious, that it's through no fault of your own. You worked hard, you bought your house, you did everything right, you've started a business, and then it's literally all washed away by what I've always found very fascinating is called an act of God. So Dauber's pointing out that, like, the American state is there for definitely, not all white people, that's very clear, but, to be white is to be by default more virtuous than other people and thus more deserving. But it's been there for people who got into situations of suffering that seem unfair because they're a disaster, because they're random, because they're not the result of their own moral agency or lack of character, virtue, responsibility. So that really makes you think about the Great Depression, which was an economic problem, and a lot of people interpreted, especially men who had lost everything and lost their status as providers in the 30s, thought of often as a personal moral failing. Why aren't you getting a job? Why can't I support my family? I'm emasculated by this. Obviously, it's very clear that these are gigantic structural forces that are far beyond the individual choices or merit of particular people. But it's hard to see it that way when it's a social or economic disaster versus a natural disaster. But in many ways, the Great Depression was a random act of disaster that wiped out people's, everything they'd worked for, just gone, right? We're in one of those situations with the COVID pandemic now. And, it is interesting to see that a Republican president and a Republican Senate and also the Democratic Party, which has been, rather parsimonious on these things as well, immediately, more or less immediately decided in the, depths of the crisis, or the depths of the beginning of the crisis in spring 2020, that we've got to do something. Just bam, send the money out. We'll figure it out later. This is a disaster. And COVID, it's an economic problem, but it also seems like a natural disaster because it originates seemingly from the natural world. Of course, you could make an argument that it originates from our human intervention into the natural world, which has unleashed a lot of these forces, more of which I think we'll see. But it seems almost like a flood or a hurricane or a disaster. And so at first there's a sense that this person's always worked hard. They're good. They're decent. They're my neighbor. They're me. They're not this lazy person or, junkie lying in a flop house somewhere who's made bad choices and deserves to be in misery. These are good, normal people who've started businesses or saved money, worked hard, built families, and randomly, cruelly, all that would be taken away. We don't want that, for one thing, because it would lead to a collapse of social stability and order, but also because it just clearly is not fair. We clearly have the resources to, make sure that everybody stays in their home and is fed, but how do we do that? In America, it's very hard to figure out because we always have to do things in the most complicated way possible and try to conceal the hand of government as it intervenes. People want a hand up, not a handout. That's the cliched expression. So what do you do now? I don't know. I can't say that. I'm certainly not going to make political predictions, and I don't know the course of what this crisis is going to take. But I do know that our moral imaginary about who's deserving and what's fair has been very subject to uneven development, so to speak, in American history. We've sort of brought people into the fold of the deserving in fits and starts, in little bits, and we are probably going to continue to do that. From my point of view, a better way to look at it would be to say that everybody deserves something. You will notice that the policies that have been most enduring and popular in American social policy, such as Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, the FDIC, really, in a way, have applied across the board without means testing, without saying, well, if you make $59,000, you can get this benefit, but if you make $59,050, well, then no, you're out. That's too much. We don't want to be giving away money to people who don't deserve it. This came up in the recent Democratic presidential nomination race when Senator Amy Klobuchar and others were saying that free college would be unfair because rich kids would get to go to college for free. In some ways, that seems to make sense on its face, but what it results in is that a lot of people don't get to go to college because we're cutting our nose off to spite our face. Social Security, Medicare, those policies, I know there are some exceptions and some carve-outs that were very inequitable, but broadly speaking, are perceived to be universal entitlements. And those have been more successful than policies like aid to families with dependent children, which by definition were established for people who we felt sorry for or were otherwise in a situation that to some extent seemed like it was not their fault. We're all in a situation now which, on an individual basis is not our fault. So we have a lumpy net. It would be much nicer if we had a, smoother, stronger, more uniform net. And it would be nice to have a hammock too, as a matter of fact. So I don't know where this is going to go, but I wanted to bring you these suggestions for reading over the summer before we get back to another semester in paradise. Protecting Soldiers and Mothers, Pitied but Not Entitled, The Sympathetic State. Also, if you're really a masochist, you could read John Rawls' Theory of Justice. Anyway, stay shrill in your hammocks And we'll be back with more episodes soon. All right. Bye.